Greetings, everyone. My name is Mark Nutter. I'm the grants manager at New Hampshire Audubon. I just want to thank you so much for deciding to spend some time with us this evening. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you near our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the ancient site and the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, or human beings in Abenaki, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. I would like to invite you to learn about the indigenous presence on the land that you occupy by potentially visiting the website native-land.ca. Here you can see and click on different territories of indigenous peoples and get connected to additional educational resources. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, I invite you to check out all of the eye-opening educational resources available at indigenousnh.com, including this particular story map, which details the history of Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, specifically here in New Hampshire. These resources have helped me recognize the ongoing consequences of colonialism for all people of color and the need for change in our current society. Thank you for your interest in tonight's topic, the place we call home with Dr. Maria Sanders. It's been such a pleasure working with Maria after just cold calling her back in December and saying, hey, we've got this idea. Is it a good one? And she jumped on board and really helped us refine this huge project and undertaking that we're now kicking off tonight. And she is not only giving two talks in this project, she's also our humanities expert. And as you know, and as the slide says, this 12-month-long webinar speaker series is called Exploring Connections to and Stewardship of the Natural World. And before I hand it off to Maria, I'd just like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar and series fits into the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that's completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 programmatic pillars: connecting people to nature through environmental education experiences like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like these; researching and conserving species in peril, including large raptors and small birds; managing about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation; and finally, advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. I'm here today because of donors and members like you. We also have a huge network of over 2,000 volunteers that assist us with everything from wildlife monitoring to ambassador animal care, to environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you're a volunteer, member, or supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. We simply couldn't do it without you. And if you would like to become a part of our conservation family, please check out our website for ways to get involved. And I see that we have about 27 people on Zoom and 8 people watching this on Facebook. So hello, welcome. We are in full webinar mode. So we can't see you, but you can see and hear us, obviously. And so we're going to interact in a slightly different way. We have 2 ways, the chat and the Q&A feature. And so we're going to use the chat for kind of reflections and thoughts and comments, and more of the Q&A for the questions that you might have for Dr. Sanders. For fun, those of you on Zoom, if you want to type into the chat where you're watching this from, it'd be great to see where you're calling in from. It's definitely a change from our usual in-person stuff, but we found that we've been able to reach more people through Zoom and these online webinars. Diane DeLuca, who is a senior biologist at New Hampshire Audubon, has been instrumental in organizing this entire speaker series. Truly, she's done all of the work. I'm just here mashing the buttons on Zoom and Facebook. So she's joining us tonight to help monitor both the chat and the Q&A. And I'll be focused on monitoring those Facebook Live questions. And we'll let Maria know when she has a question that we want to answer, and she'll stop along the way to answer those questions throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Sanders. Dr. Maria Sanders, a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and licensed attorney, has dedicated 3 decades to researching scientific variables for living full and flourishing lives, including the development of resilience and the exploration of how spaces become meaningful places. During the fall of 2019, Dr. Sanders traveled for 5 months to all 50 states in the US, filming interviews, documenting people's experiences with place. As a public philosopher, she has written blogs, curated art exhibitions, hosted radio and television shows, and taught philosophy at the college level for over 30 years. Dr. Sanders' philosophy holds that intentionally selecting, creating, and protecting the physical environments within which we feel a natural affinity is essential for living a full and nourishing life. The places where we live, work, and spend our leisure must be a good fit for our health and well-being if we are to thrive in our existence. Just as the farmer cares about the soil, water, and air around their crops in order to maximize excellent growth of those crops, caring about our natural environments provides an essential place for our physical, mental, and spiritual growth and well-being. So please give a warm webinar welcome to Dr. Sanders.
There we go. Well, thank you, Mark. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Before I get started, I do want to thank Mark and Diane and the New Hampshire Audubon Society, as well as New Hampshire Humanities, for making this program possible. It has been really a lot of fun working with both Mark and Diane, and I echo everything that Mark was saying. That it's been a really great project to work on, and I personally invite everyone who's attending here to hit as many of these sessions as you can, that we are so excited about all the different speakers that'll be participating in this program. Let me start with just giving you a little background that will help frame my approach, especially within environmental ethics and this whole topic of place. I'm actually an applied ethicist. So that's a type of philosopher that delves into how we should live our lives, but in a very practical way. And so most of my research and work is out in the communities, both the communities that I live in and are near me and near and dear here in New Hampshire, but also worldwide. You know, I've done research in England and France and Greece and Turkey. And one thing that was very striking to me is, regardless of where we go, there is this huge impact on place when we look at how human experience develops. So I've spent a little over 30 years now studying an ancient Greek concept called eudaimonia. We don't really have an English term for it, so I just kind of left it in the Greek format here. We tend to translate it to mean happiness, but that doesn't really capture the full meaning of eudaimonia. If you think about how happiness, that term is used in the United States, if you ask somebody if they're happy, what we're really asking is either, how are you feeling right now? You know, are you happy? Or how's your life going so far? You know, life satisfaction or contentment. You know, are you happy with your life so far? But when the ancient Greeks were talking about happiness, and in the context of this term eudaimonia, what they were talking about was not just how things are going right now or in the past leading up to this moment, but looking very comprehensively towards the future as well. And that's where this living a full and flourishing life comes into play. So I've spent a lot of time studying the various scientific variables that people have reported increasing their levels of happiness. And taking this kind of a very holistic approach towards it naturally led me down the road of studying place. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that it didn't hit a little sooner in my career. But now that I've really started looking at place and how spaces become meaningful places, how people connect with the places they interact with, it has become a cornerstone for me within the development of environmental ethics. So environmental ethics is a way not only of framing tonight's talk, but it's going to be serve kind of as a foundation throughout this entire series of exploring connections to the natural world. So it would probably be well worthwhile for us just to take a moment and make sure we're clear on what we mean by environmental ethics. The term ethics is one that probably a lot of people are familiar with, but in its most general context, what ethics actually means is how should I live my life? So it really isn't necessarily prescribing a set of morals or right or wrong. That can be part of ethics. But in its most general context, ethics is merely the philosophical study of how we should live. Like, what does life look like? And environmental ethics is the sub category within philosophy, within ethics, the discipline that studies the moral relationship of human beings to, and also the value and moral status of the environment and its non-human contents. So in other words, those connections between us and the various ecosystems that we come into contact with. So if we think about the places that we call home and put it in this context of full and flourishing living, so Eudaimonic lifestyles, as well as a framework of environmental ethics, it leads us really to exploring what I would call the good stewardship of our home, envisioned through an ethical relationship between human beings and nature. A lot of times the environmental ethicists will refer to this as human beings and non-human, either life form or non-living things as well. So it takes into consideration all of nature. So when we think of the sense of place, okay, that connection, this phrase sense of place, how we'll be using that tonight is really to denote a difference or a distinction between space and place. So when I use the term space, I'm merely referring to either a geographic location, or at the other extreme, it can be a void, is a space. Once we talk about place, however, space has meaning. And so as soon as we connect with the spaces that we come into contact with, they become places. And so the sense of place is really important, especially within this research area of eudaimonia, because time and time again, research has shown when we feel connected to not only people around us, to our communities, but also to our natural environments, our self-reported levels of happiness spike. And so sense of place really grounds the human being in a more meaningful lifestyle. So it's really this connection, this sense of place that gives space meaning, okay, that actually converts it to a place. So place impacts our experiences, clearly. But when we think about place, and this was a shift that it literally took a couple centuries for the philosophers as they were talking about place. Initially, a lot of philosophers thought of place as a backdrop, you know, almost like a canvas that we were drawing on with our experiences. But as we moved further along in this kind of philosophical reflection, we think of it kind of as a discourse over time. A lot of your phenomenologists and your later philosophers started realizing that place isn't the backdrop for our human experiences. It's necessarily interwoven with those experiences. In other words, you can't separate place from experience. We can't have experiences without place. So they necessarily depend upon each other and they necessarily impact each other. most of the images, this little side note as I'm going through the presentation here, are images that I took while we were on that 5-month journey to all 50 states in the United States. And so I'll try to remember to mention like where these locations are, but this particular image that you're looking at is in Hawaii. It's in Pahoa on the big Hawaiian island. And you can see some black lava rock at the forefront there. All right, so framing this within environmental ethics, there are clearly too many issues and topics within environmental ethics for us to tackle in a single hour. So what I've elected to do is to basically focus on the 5 big areas that any philosopher who's researching or studying within environmental ethics, they're going to hit on these 5 areas. And so the first one is the consumption of natural resources. When we think about place impacting our experiences, it's actually also true to flip that experience impacts place as well. This particular image was actually taken in Southern Oregon. It's clearly a redwood tree. They're massive and gorgeous. But there's a real threat to the redwood forests in both Northern California and Southern Oregon. In fact, 95% of the original coastal redwood forests have been cut down during the past century. And now they have an additional threat with all the wildfires that are occurring, especially in Northern California. In fact, during our trip across the country, this was the only location we had mapped out where we were staying before we even started the trip. This was the only location that we had to actually reschedule mid-journey. We were going to stay in a tree house in the middle of the redwood forest in Northern California, but it was all on fire at the time that we were driving through. And sadly, what we discovered shortly afterwards is the fire was started by someone not properly putting out a campfire. So again, easily avoidable. And these are the things as we think about our natural resources, you know, if we're not focused on tending and caring to the resources, it won't take long and we'll obviously lose a lot of these resources. In fact, the latest study I was reading on water is 40% now of people living in the world today really don't have access to clean water. Water has become a scarcity and a real issue. So it's something for us to think about as we're moving towards the future generations. You know, what the deontologists in philosophy would call our duty ethics. You know, do we have a duty to those future generations? And we'll talk about that more in just a bit. So as we're thinking about places and natural resources that are like real gems that we definitely want to preserve for those future generations, this was a place on our journey across the United States that I would put up there in, it's really hard to rank my favorite places, but this is definitely in the top 10. It is a cavern that exists 22 stories underground underneath the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And it's a little deceptive, the angle of this photo. This is of the suite. They built an actual suite in the center of the cavern. But the cavern is actually the largest, darkest, has the cleanest air of all caverns in the world. I mean, it's a huge, massive cavern. And it has all these little tunnels that go in all different directions. So I took this shot rather close up, but behind the actual sofa that you're looking at the back side of it right now, there are 2 queen size beds. And you can notice off to the sides, what they did is they came in and really just built about a 3-foot wall in the center of this cavern and created a room right in the middle of the cavern. What you can't see in this particular angle is just behind the bookcase is a bathroom. So they have a toilet in there as well as a shower, but all the water supply is hand carried down They carry 100 gallons of water on a daily basis down to the suite. And if someone staying in the suite needs more than 100 gallons, then you know that there's an individual that has to carry all of that down for you. So water conservation is always on your mind when you're in the cavern. They only have one suite in the cavern. So it rents 365 times a year, so once per night. And it's an amazing experience. If anyone ever gets a chance, I highly, highly recommend it. I want to give you a few more facts about it. It stays at 56 degrees year round. So it doesn't matter if you're there in the dead heat of Arizona desert weather or in the middle of their cooler time. It's always cool and comfortable in the cavern. There are no living things in the cavern, so there's no bats. There are no critters of any sort, no bugs. We're not entirely sure why, because that's not necessarily the case in all caverns, but in this particular cavern, they've never had any creatures that live for any particular length of time. And I say that because there have been some animals that fell through sinkholes. And I've got a little later photo here. I'll show you one of them where they mummify in the cavern. So we know they survived for a little while, but they didn't survive for any length of time. Most of the rock in the cavern is limestone. So that's why the air is so clean. In fact, when I was on this sabbatical trip, part of my purpose was to conduct interviews with the people who were either responsible for converting these spaces into places, or they are now the caretakers for these places. And when I was interviewing the couple that oversees the cavern, they shared a story about a gentleman who had very severe asthma. But when he stayed in the cavern, he said that that was the best he had breathed in his entire life, was that night. And I believe it. After spending the night there, it was very clean air. It was not what I had expected. I kind of expected a little bit of that like dust in the air, being surrounded by rock and dirt, but it really wasn't. It was very clean air. The other thing I was surprised about is I am claustrophobic. And so when I was booking this particular stay, I wasn't quite sure when I heard 22 stories underground. Do I really want no other living things down there? You know, how's this really going to turn out? But I have to tell you, it did not feel claustrophobic at all. It was actually quite open. In the upper left-hand photo here, this is what they called Snowball Palace. It was one of my favorite formations in the cavern, where the limestone had formed into these really look like little snowball structures. And then on the opposite corner, the upper right-hand corner, you can see a crystalline formation there. There were a number of different kinds of formations. There was, we saw stalagmite, cave onyx, flowstone, and a lot of selenite in the cavern. They do offer tours like throughout the day. So if you're staying in the suite, you might have a tour moving through around you. But if you stay in the suite, you have full run of the cavern really the entire time you're there. But after the tours end, I think they roughly ended about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The rest of the evening, the cavern was just for whoever the suite guests were. So all night long, my 14-year-old son went on this trip with me. We were exploring throughout the cavern, and that was a lot of fun. There's a lot of interesting things in the cavern. It actually is an emergency shelter. So they have a section there if the United States is ever attacked. This is one of the places. There are supplies, food supplies, blankets, so forth, to survive in the cavern. In the center photo here was one of my favorite little critters that was in the cavern. This is an ancient sloth. Her name was Gertie. The University of Arizona faculty had named her, but she was found in the cavern. They dated it that she had fallen through a sinkhole approximately 11,000 years ago. And by looking at some of the like claw markings on the wall near where she was found, what they're thinking is that she fell through the sinkhole, and although she is over 10 feet tall, again, the photo's a little deceptive, but this is a very large animal. She was just a baby. And so when they saw the claw marks on the wall, they're assuming that the mother sloth was probably still up landside and calling to the baby, and it was trying to crawl out, which is a little bit sad. But it did mummify. There was also a bobcat that had fallen down a similar sinkhole, and it was mummified as well. And they found some human remains that they were able to tie back to one of the local tribes, to Native Americans, and those remains were returned to the tribe. But they do tend to, they're still exploring some of these other tunnel areas, so they do tend to think that there's still some more discoveries to be made in the caverns. The bottom right-hand side, that little black, what you can see there, kind of little black door area, that's an elevator. And if you look just to the right of it, you can see the very bottom part of a ladder sticking out. To get down to the cavern, you do access it through the elevator, but if the elevator ever breaks down, there is a ladder to crawl back up to surface side. And I did find an interesting story when I was interviewing again, the couple that were caretakers for this space. They said that back when the cavern was first discovered, which was in the early 1920s, it was like 1927, when they first discovered this cavern, the original gentleman that had discovered the cavern was offering tours to visitors, but they didn't have an elevator, they didn't have ladders. So to get them into the cavern, they would tie a rope around their waist and just hoist them down. Keep in mind, 22 stories with this rope hoisting them down. And then they could tour the cavern. But the catch was they ran this little tour business until about 5 o'clock every afternoon. And at 5 o'clock promptly, that rope came back up. So if someone wasn't back at the kind of the whole entrance area to catch the rope, they were stuck in the cavern overnight. And so surface side, they have a little museum that dates some of the various activities that have happened over the years at the cavern. And there's a display there that they call Dope on the Rope. And that's what they said the locals would call the visitors, because they couldn't believe that they would agree to go down into this cavern just with a rope tied around their waist. And a lot of them did get stuck overnight in the cavern. So the elevator, much better system to get in and out of the cavern. And this is their little cafe restaurant that's in the caverns as well. Now, if you follow kind of behind, what we're looking at is the restaurant. So standing behind us is where the suite would be. So your room, you can't actually directly see the restaurant because it's a little off to the right, but you're not very far from where the restaurant is at. Again, people can just decide to come and have a meal. They only serve lunch and dinner, and it's mainly sandwiches. It's nothing real fancy because, again, there's not a kitchen at the grotto. Everything is hand carried down. It's all made surface side. And then there's not a real good shot of it here, but to the left side of the deck area where the grotto sits, at the bottom there, you can see kind of like a little box or wooden structure. There's a kind of a dumbbell system where they would hoist the food up. So they carried it up, and there would be a waitress up by the tables, and then they would hoist the food up and the drinks, so that then she would grab it off of a little kind of surface side, just small little elevator, just large enough for a couple plates of food, and she'd platter it for you then. But there were only, when we were there were seating for 3 tables. I think they've taken that down now with the current situation with social distancing. Now I think there's only 1 table that can be seated in this space. So anyway, when we talk about natural places that you definitely like to see preserved for future generations, that would be one that I would have on my list. I would definitely like to see my children's children and their children get to see the canyon underneath the Grand Canyon. But so let's just take a moment, because I'm always looking for interesting new places. share with us, and you can just put this in the chat, is probably the easiest way. Some of the special places that you would say, yeah, these are must preserve places, places that we definitely would want future generations to be able to visit. Just go ahead and add your favorite places into the chat. And I'm going to lean on Mark and Diane to watch that chat because I can't really see it on my screen. So Diane, I'm going to hop over to you. Do we have any places that in the chat that you can share?
There are a couple that are in here. The Painted Desert in Arizona.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And Gulf Haggis in Maine. I think I'm saying that correctly. Hagus in Maine.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Maybe, Marianne, maybe you could share a little bit more about that spot. And then Jess is saying one of my favorite places was Sedona, Arizona. There were so many great places to hike.
Yeah, that is true. And there's so many places as you get around those regions where, especially with the cacti, that only grow in particular hiking areas. So it's always fun to explore and discover the plant life and vegetation out in that area.
Edward shares Button Bay, Vermont. And I'm not sure where Button Bay, Vermont is either.
Yeah, I haven't been to that one either. That if you can add just a little more information on that one, because I'd like to go, anything this local in Vermont or Maine, I definitely would like to go check out if I haven't been there.
Marianne says Gulf Haggis is considered the Grand Canyon of Maine.
Ah, so that's definitely worth seeing. I'm going to let people continue.
Turtle Pond in Roslindale, Mass. A little hidden gem in the city. Yeah,
I've been to that one, and that is a gem. I actually think of that as one of the best kept secrets down in the city area.
Chaco Canyon from Carolyn.
I've been to that one.
And L. Hooper, Craters of the Moon National Park in Idaho.
Yeah, that one I have been to. That's very, very cool.
Bold Coast, Maine. Maine has all kinds of gems. Carolyn, love that on Lake Champlain. Canoe camping in Lake Umbagog. That's definitely a gem. Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park and Acadia National Park on Mount Desert.
Yeah, we're gonna have to definitely capture this entire chat because there's a whole laundry list of places there I want to go visit now. You know, and with how relatively close that is to New Hampshire, I've never been to Lake Champlain. I need to get over there. I know that's such a gorgeous place.
And a lot of these spots are pretty local.
Mm-hmm.
Maine, Vermont, or New Hampshire.
Well, I think with coming off the global pandemic here, we're all probably getting a little cabin fever. So we'll definitely have to put our list together of places to see. And nice thing is with a lot of the hiking places is we can still do that even as people are still accessing their vaccinations and such.
Yeah, so a couple more. Florida Keys, Isle Royale in Michigan, which I've heard really great things about. Everglades.
Oh, yes.
And Pam is sharing that the spelling is coming up funky in the chat, which is probably why I'm having trouble reading some of them.
Well, in the interest of time, keep adding those to the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and move on just because we've got a couple more things I want to build to our chat as well. And then we will capture that chat at the end of the session here. But as we think about these natural resources and how the natural resources really warrant our attention, our protection, it leads us naturally into another main topic area within environmental ethics that a lot of the ethicists spend time really thinking about if we have, and if so, to what extent, a moral responsibility to future generations. Do we actually have, as I mentioned a little earlier, a duty to future generations, our children's children, their children, and so forth? Or do we not owe anything to anyone except ourselves, and it's just about my life and the time that I'm here? What you'll find is most of your environmental ethicists do feel that there's a responsibility to future generations, although they vary in the details of what they think that responsibility entails. So a couple ways to approach this. We can look at it through natural resources, as I mentioned a little earlier, things like water that everyone needs to survive. Is that something not only that we should be protecting for future generations, that we have some sort of responsibility, ethical responsibility to do so, but are there also ethical responsibilities right now, for 40% of people on Earth who really are experiencing water scarcity, or walking basically 10,000 miles or just to get fresh water. They're spending all day just getting fresh water for their families and not being able to go to school or get educated, engage in other activities. One of the areas, and the reason I picked this particular image, is one of the areas when we think about future generations that definitely comes to the forefront are landfills. Now we have a lot of different types of landfills, hazardous waste or municipal waste. But the one I want to focus on, and I think it plays very naturally into a lot of the places that my son and I visited during our journey, are the industrial landfills, the ones that literally are used for construction and demolition waste. So in other words, all of the waste that comes from building our buildings or demolishing our existing structures and buildings. And it naturally lends the ethicist to raise the question, do we have some sort of moral responsibility to repurpose these structures? Should we be making efforts rather than filling our landfills to either repair the existing structures that are there, or in many cases, if it's outlived its original functionality, converting it so that it has some new or different purpose. When we took our 5-month journey, we stayed at literally over 100 different places. And I intentionally tried to avoid the really commercialized or popular places in the United States. We were actually looking for a lot of those hidden gems. And I was also looking for more private places where private individuals had converted spaces and now opened it up in a very limited sort of way, but to other visitors, to not the general public per se, but kind of an invited public. So we stayed at a number of places that were converted. This first one that I want to share, again, rose to the top of the list of not only what can be done with a structure that's outlived its purpose, but some of the other philosophical lessons that go along with converting a structure such as this. It's called the Has-Been. It's in Elvin, Illinois. And this was the vision of a lady, actually farmer's wife, named Mary Seaman. And when Mary decided to convert this grain bin into a living structure, she now uses it as a bed and breakfast, but a little living dwelling. Her neighbors thought she had lost her mind. They could not see why she was doing what she was doing. And that's why I have this particular quote here by the philosopher Bertrand Russell: "Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric." What seemed like this far out crazy idea that Mary had, now she has not only a profitable little side business, but it has grown into almost the envy of a lot of her neighbors. They love to come and stay at the Has-Been. Now, the reason she called it the Has-Been is because this particular grain bin had been on this location previously. So to share the story of the Has-Been, in the 1950s, it was like the mid 1950s, It was on this particular land when her grandfather owned the land and was running it as a farm. And so it was actually being used as a grain bin. And it was used as a grain bin for about 20 years. And then he sold his farm, and the bin was moved roughly about 6 miles down the road to one of the neighbors' farms, and that was in the 70s. And they continued to use it as a grain bin for a few more years, about another decade. And then when they stopped using it as a grain bin, they were going to just throw it away. And before it was hauled away, Mary approached the neighbor and asked if she could either purchase it back and ultimately, I think they just donated it to her. But what you can see in the lower right-hand picture, they put it up on a trailer, and it was really just a trailer that one of the farmers had for hauling hay, and drove it the 6 miles back down the road to return it to its previous location. This is what it looks like inside. Now, part of Mary's vision was to keep the feel of the grain bin, but obviously cleaned up. And so it was a borderline luxurious place to stay. So in the upper left-hand photo, the shot of the ceiling, you can see she was very deliberate in keeping that spherical shape and look in how she ran the decorative wood. But what was really interesting is the lower left-hand photo, and you have to look kind of close here. I'm not sure how well it's even going to show with the lighting, but she ran the wood around the interior walls horizontally. Now, we stayed in a number of silos that had been converted and a number of both corn bins and grain bins. This was the only bin or even round structure that we stayed in where the remodel ran the walls horizontal. So much easier to do this vertically and just kind of stack the wood side by side. In fact, she went through a number of different types of wood. It was a lot of trial and error before they could find the wood that was flexible enough to bend far enough so that it could maintain that shape of the inside of the bin without snapping, but also be firm enough to offer the support they needed. But again, keeping true to her vision, she felt this was really important because if you look in the lower right-hand side, the outside of the bin, it maintains that same feel of the grain bin. Now, the upper right-hand side is the entrance. So you can see she does a lot of other kind of steampunk type art, converting items rather than throwing them away. But the lower right-hand picture, the reason I included this photo of the window, this was another challenge that Mary ran into, is she said literally they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and they hadn't thought about it. That when they ordered the window, they thought it would be a half hour, 45-minute job to install the window, until they realized this is curved. They're not installing it on a flat surface. And she said it turned into a 4, almost 5-hour project, but they did finally figure out how to create the support and install their square window into their round form. So there has been great success, and largely because of her persistence and resilience when she was facing challenges. Some other repurposed structures, a lot of trains. We stayed in 3 different cabooses. I have photos of 2 of them here. On the left side, both the upper and lower photos on the left side are the same train. That's in Decorah, Iowa. And this was a rancher. He had a small little horse ranch, and he was also a carpenter. He had spent years working with wood. And so you'll notice in that lower left-hand photo, when he refurbished the inside of the train, he used a lot of wood. And interestingly, these 2 chairs in the lower left-hand photo that you see right up front are from the original travel cars in this same train, that you can flip that, like the backrest part of the chair flips to the other side. And they did that on the trains because they would have people facing forward when the train was going forward. And then when the train went backwards, then they would flip the chairs so they were still facing forward rather than facing backwards. And the windows behind where they have the chairs positioned, you look out onto the horses from their horse ranch grazing in the pasture. So it's beautiful scenery, especially in the morning to wake up to, because the sun would rise off that side as well. And so you could flip those chairs and you had this wonderful view out the picture windows, but in the evenings, you could flip them back and you'll notice across from it, you can barely kind of see in the lower corner there is a couch. And so it was a nice little just visiting conversation area in the evenings. In the upper right-hand corner, that one was refurbished from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it's in Castanata, Pennsylvania, right by Lock Haven, if you're familiar with that region of Pennsylvania. Not too far from Altoona, where the Horseshoe Curve exists. And then we also had stayed, I didn't have a photo of it here, but we also stayed at a caboose that had been repurposed in North Carolina, and they completely decked out. They had an entire warehouse where a miniature train setup was built in. They had a game room. They had several train cars. So they were creating almost a full kind of train motel experience with all these carts. So it was, and they also ran a buffalo ranch off to the side. So at that particular location, you'd wake up to see the buffaloes. And then the lower right-hand side, this was a train station that a lady had moved to her property in Laverne, North Dakota. And she actually was constructing an entire little village on her property of all these abandoned structures. So she had a one-room schoolhouse. She had this train station. She had a little church. Again, it's kind of one of the small little community churches. And she was in the process of looking for a couple additional structures too, but they were all structures that were going to be demolished. And instead, she brought them to her property and rents them out now, basically as a kind of little bed and breakfast type setups. So here again, in this one, because this is where one of my passions lie, I would love to hear about either places that are like dwellings now, whether it's open to the public or not. It may even just be private individuals that have taken a structure that was going to be discarded or demolished, and they've converted it somehow into something really cool. Go ahead and post your experiences, the places that you're familiar with, in the chat. And while you're posting those, I'll tell you about a couple others that we had stayed at in Viroqua, Wisconsin. There were a couple large tobacco warehouses that, again, had outlived their purpose. And one had been converted into an actual, it was multi-purpose, really. It had a couple dwellings that you could stay at. And we stayed in one of these dwellings within the larger warehouse, but it also had office spaces. Like they had converted it into kind of a multi-purpose type structure. But what was really cool is behind it, there was a second tobacco warehouse that had been abandoned. And that one they converted into a used bookstore. Very, very cool. Because again, a huge building. And you just felt like when you were going through the bookstore, it was just this maze. But both of those had taken warehouses that otherwise probably would have ended up being kind of distracting to the town and turned those negatives into positives. So I'm going to turn it back over to Diane for a minute. Do we have some places popping up in our chat?
One popped up that's really interesting from Charlie. Way back, lived in a converted Lehigh Valley trained snowplow outside Ithaca, New York.
Oh, very cool. Do we have any others in there? If not, I'm going to start moving on because I'm looking at our time too. And I think I'm talking too much on each of these.
That's it for now.
Okay, well, we've got another really interesting area here, and that is the value of non-human entities. So animals and plants, although my focus here is going to be on non-human animals. We stayed at several sanctuaries during our travels. It involved wild horses and wolves and big cats. And so I'm going to share a couple of those with you. But how the ethicists really frame the issue of non-human entities comes back to how we define the value that we place on things. And interestingly, humans always seem to make it in the mix. So what we call that in philosophy is speciesism, like where we're kind of giving preference to our own species over other species. But from there are several different theories. Probably the most common in the West still is anthropocentrism, which is the idea that human beings are the most important. So they have intrinsic value in and of themselves, whereas non-human animals and plants only have instrumental value. So they're valuable if they're of use to humans. That's an anthropocentric view. But then there's also a biocentric view that says, no, all living things or feeling things, sentient beings have value. Some biocentricisms also include plants in that mix. But then you also have ecocentric systems, which say, no, it's not just about humans or animals and plants, it's about systems. Ecosystems have value. So again, how we frame where we place the value drives then how we behave as human beings and how we treat these non-human elements. So I'll share a few sanctuaries that were kind of a little bit of a surprise to me, finding these in the United States and where we found them. But we did visit Wolf Creek Habitat and Rescue. This is actually in Brookville, Indiana, which I would have expected to find it much further north. But again, the lady who runs this, her name's Kathy, she basically had started rescuing some wolf dogs, and now she only has purebred wolves, and she doesn't breed them. They're all wolves that otherwise would have been put down, and she currently has 40 of these wolves. And of course, it's really important to remember these are wild animals. They're not dogs, they're not pets. And they have very prominent dominance behavior, which you can see in the left-hand photo here. We saw all 40 of the wolves. She had a catwalk built above the various habitats. Now, they're not all together because they basically have their own little social groups. But on this catwalk, you can walk above them and kind of look into the habitats and see all the wolves that she has. And it was an awesome experience to hear them start howling. It was like a whole symphony as they would start talking to each other. And very interestingly, with the howling, some of the wolves she had just a small amount. I think there were like 4 or 5 of them she had rescued from Canada. And what they had started to notice was the Canadian wolves did not join in when the American wolves were howling. If a Canadian wolf began the howl, only the Canadian wolves would respond. And likewise, if an American wolf began the howling, only the American wolves of all the various little social groups would respond. So they were just starting to look into possible questions of, are there multiple languages going on amongst these wolves? But back to the wolves we visited, the 4 wolves in this particular social group were all cousins. And what you see in the left-hand picture is the alpha female and the omega female. The omega was Athena. The alpha is Takora, it was her name. Takora was always kind of exhibiting her dominance the entire time we were there. And we were in the habitat with this group of 4 wolves for about 5 hours. It honestly felt like 15 minutes. It went really fast, but we were there quite a while. The alpha female, Takora, she didn't want anything to do with my son. Like, you could definitely tell the difference between female and male gender differences. She wasn't aggressive towards him. She wouldn't come towards him. I did stay between him and her the whole time, and it seemed like she kind of viewed him as my pup, and so she was okay with that. But the Athena, the omega female, immediately took to my son. And so that was where I had some concerns. In fact, there was a whole training that he had to go through before he could enter this habitat, because we didn't want the alpha female to feel threatened by him in any way. But one thing I did find really interesting in watching the dominance behavior is the other 2 cousins would only put up with this dominance behavior to a certain extent. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand photo here. The wolf that has its paw up is Zonka, was her name, but that was a wasn't an alpha, wasn't an omega. It was just kind of in the mix. And what you would find is they wouldn't directly challenge the alpha wolf, but at some point, if she carried on too long or got a little too violent with the omega female, these other two would step in and do this kind of behavior. It was kind of like, it's enough, like that's good, but without directly challenging her. And it would put a stop to it every time. So it's kind of interesting to watch that dynamic. I hadn't seen that before in observing wolves. The other place we had gone was the sanctuary for large cats. And this was largely cats that had been rescued out of people's backyards, as well as the entertainment industry, where they're breeding them. Either they didn't have any cubs at all. They obviously don't do any breeding at sanctuaries, but they didn't have cubs because usually the cubs in these petting zoos and such don't survive. They have very short lifespans. So what you see here is on the right-hand side is a Bengal tiger. They had a lot of Bengal. In fact, most of their tigers were actual white tigers that were Bengal tigers. And then they also had a lot, like on the left here, that one might look a little different to you. That's called a liger. The father would be a lion, the mother a tiger. And they had quite a few of these ligers and what's called tigons, where the father's a tiger and the mother's a lion, because that has become quite popular in the entertainment industry. But ligers really shouldn't exist, because if you think about it, lions and tigers out in the wild would not come into contact with each other. And if they did, they wouldn't breed. We don't really classify ligers as its own species because it can't reproduce. All of the male ligers are sterile. So we have the existence of these creatures now because they've been created, which raises all kinds of philosophical questions as well. But in the wild, they would not have naturally come into existence. Here's some of the white tigers. And again, I included this because it shows the behavior modification program that they have going. This is not training by any means. They're not like using them for entertainment. They don't have shows. It's largely to reduce stress and to keep the tigers from getting bored as they go through different kind of exercises with them. They're never forced to participate. Some days they're just not interested. A lot of times they are. And it does help, they said, when the vet has to carry out medical treatments, that a lot of the behaviors they're going through helps them when they have to give them different kinds of vaccinations and such. They don't always have to put the tigers under anesthesia if they can go through some of these patterns of modification. And then the upper right-hand photo, this guy, he's still largely overweight, as you can see from the photo, but when they first rescued him, he was actually 900 pounds. And they said that when visitors would come, they actually thought he was a polar bear because he was so large. But he was rescued from someone's backyard and they really didn't understand proper nutrition. And so the sanctuary was working on bringing him back down to a healthy weight. So again, into the chat, are there other sanctuaries, and I'm going to share one more here with wild horses in South Dakota that we went to, but are there other sanctuaries that you're familiar with and that you visited with that are really doing some pretty great work in giving some of that inherent value back to these non-human animals that have either lost it out of entertainment industries, or quite often it's individuals trying to make pets out of wild animals? So in the chat, are there some other sanctuaries that are doing some really good work in this area in the United States?
One came up from DM, Austin Bat Refuge.
Oh, I didn't know about that one.
New Hampshire Audubon Wildlife Sanctuaries for resident and migratory birds.
Where Squam Lake Science Center does a lot of good too with rescuing animals that are native to New Hampshire and the New England area.
Wings of Dawn, which is a rehabilitation center in Henniker, where she does amazing work with rehabilitating birds for the most part, but she would do all animals. Sea turtle rescue in the Keys and in Texas most recently.
Yeah, I know there was one rescue with the sea turtles at South Padre Island in the Gulf of Texas. I used to live in Weslaco, Texas and McAllen, Texas. So I'm familiar kind of with that area down there. I forgot about them. They do some good work with sea turtles.
Someone is saying, on behalf of plant species, the Arnold Arboretum. I must agree with them.
Yeah, that's on my list. I haven't been there. That is on my list to visit.
Wolf Hollow, Ipswich, Mass.
Oh, see, now I wasn't familiar with that one.
VINS, Vermont Institute of Natural Science, which rescues birds of prey, and they're just over the border.
Very cool.
Word Center of Birds of Prey in Idaho. Oh, that world, it's probably supposed to say. From Michelle, International Crane Society. Thank you, L. Hooper corrected me. World Center. It should be.
Well, keep them coming. Again, in interest of time, I'm going to move forward here, but keep them coming because we'll capture that chat so that people can kind of look back on the list as well. The next area of environmental ethics, governmental regulation of property. Now, this is one that ends up being kind of a twofold area within the philosophical side of applied ethics. In other words, there's a whole range of questions that center around who should be governing what. So should property be governed by or regulated by our government, or should it be regulated by individuals? And of course, a large part of this grows out of our history with property and property ownership in the United States, draws back to Locke. So a very heavy emphasis on private property and private ownership. But then you also have all these common spaces. And so there really are some interesting things going on. In fact, I have been following, I'm also an attorney. And so I've been following what's going on right now over in Montana. There's a whole series of bills before the legislature right now where they're revisiting a lot of their regulations regarding the hunting of wolves and the hunting of bears. Right now, it's illegal for them to hunt black bears with hounds or dogs, but they're looking to open it back up and allow such hunting. They're also looking to limit the number of places where grizzly bears will be allowed to wander. And this is kind of interesting because Montana is known for having some pretty stringent protections of their wildlife. In fact, they've developed a whole tourism industry around it. Much more so when you look at some of their neighbors, both Idaho and Wyoming, they've been more aggressive, especially when it comes to like wolves and getting the wolf population down. But what is being argued now in Montana is because of a lot of these regulations and protections, the bear population has started to create problems for some of the homeowners and ranchers, and the wolves have really become problematic for a lot of the ranchers. And so several of the proposed practices, and I wrote them down here for us tonight, that they're right now, again, they've proposed in several bills, and this is with wolves, is they're looking to possibly allow spotlights at night, which is illegal right now when they're hunting wolves. They're considering allowing them to lure the wolves in using bait, wild game bait or commercial scents. They're considering allowing night vision scopes, widening the use of neck snares, which kind of choke the animal to death. And the arguments, and again, as you can imagine, there's arguments on both sides. The proponents for it are arguing that they need the deer and the elk meat as food, the humans, again, if we think of that anthropocentric view, where they're preferencing the humans over the non-human animals. And they're arguing that the wolves are basically killing off too many of the deer and the elk. But then on the flip side, the critics of the bills are arguing that this is kind of an emotional knee-jerk reaction, that it's not really taken into account all the years of management that really are lessons that have been learned in Montana, because they've always taken a more conservative approach, and in a way developing this sustainable approach to managing, because they did still allow hunting, but with these restrictions in place. And so it'll be really fascinating to see how this plays out. I haven't gotten a sense yet where the politicians are leaning, like if they're leaning one way or the other. It's been kind of flip-flopping a lot in the last week or so here. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. When we were on our trip, we went to Black Hills Wild Horse Sanctuary in South Dakota. And this is a sanctuary, started off largely for Mustangs, but they now basically permit pretty much any wild horses. In most of their horses, though, they are Mustangs. They're Spanish Mustangs, Choctaw Indian Mustangs. In fact, there are only 3 natural herds of the Choctaw Indian Mustangs still surviving, and one of them exists at this sanctuary. They have the Curly Mustangs and the American Mustangs as well. And this started basically, again, as the vision of one rancher, Dayton O'Hyde. He had gone to a horse buying auction, and he had seen all these Mustangs herded up, and he felt they looked like really miserable. And so he kind of took it upon himself to see what needed to be done to create the sanctuary. He purchased over 11,000 acres of land, and now the horses are able to roam pretty much free on this 11,000 acres. Now there is a fence around the 11,000 acres, so they're not just free to roam wherever they want. In fact, there was an interesting story that Dayton's partner shared with me. Dayton has since deceased, he passed away, but his partner was telling me that there was a Mustang that actually fell in love with a cow on the neighboring property. And so it would continue to jump the fence and go over to the neighbor's property to hang out with this cow. And the neighbor would continue to bring the Mustang back. And after about 3 times, Dayton literally told the neighbor, he's like, if you don't mind having this Mustang, my entire mission was to give the Mustangs kind of a free place to live out the rest of their life, that if it would rather live on your property, I've got no problem, with just leaving the Mustang there. And so the neighbor said, well, if he jumps the fence again, I won't bring him back. And sure enough, he jumped the fence again. And then he did live out the rest of his years with the cow over on the neighbor's property. But most of the Mustangs seem pretty content to stay on the sanctuary grounds. And they have, the horses definitely come first at the sanctuary. You definitely have that feel. They have 2 cabins where people can stay, and they give some tours like early in the morning. But for the most part, the Mustangs are kind of left to do as they please. And again, they are wild. So although we did end up heading a couple of the Mustangs, most of them keep their distance. This is on that same property. This is a river that they actually just refer to it as the Cherokee River, because the Cherokee tribe view this as a sacred place. And that's probably a topic for another presentation, is, what constitutes a sacred place, like when we denote these particular places. But they felt this was sacred because this particular river runs in all 4 directions. You can't see it in this photo because it's too large to capture in one image, but it actually runs north, south, east, and west. And so that defied logic to the Cherokee. So they would hold a lot of their ceremonies right in this location by the river. And Dayton always allowed them to continue to carry out their ceremonies at this particular location. And then our final topic for tonight, which is a big one. I kind of knew we wouldn't have time to totally go into it, but the whole idea of pollution and climate change. There are 7 main types of pollution that environmental ethicists focus on. It includes what you would imagine, air, soil pollution, radioactive pollution. But there is one that's relatively new and is getting more attention, and that is visual pollution. So in places that we find as meaningful or protected places where unattractive elements are added, let's say a lot of billboards or inappropriate signs, or cell towers have gained a lot of focus in a lot of areas. I know one in our backyard here over in Plymouth, New Hampshire. Northern Pass was looking to run their lines from Canada all the way to Texas, and they were going to go right through downtown Plymouth, which, if you've ever been to downtown Plymouth, is a really quaint, cute little town area that, with a little cafe. It's got the nice little shops down Main Street, and they were going to run this line right down the center of Main Street. And the local residents fought it. They said they wanted them to bury the line rather than to have it visible. And Northern Pass had refused to do so. And so it ended up playing out. And when it went to the legislators to vote, it got voted down. So the residents actually won that battle. But we're seeing more of those kinds of situations where people are realizing they have to take control of the visual appearance of their special places, or it is going to change. We're seeing a lot of kind of that anonymity happening just as the franchise businesses start to sprawl out from city to city. So our final chat, and I think we're just about down to our final minute too, is in the chat box. If you'll post any of the more recent, it could be maybe weather changes. We're seeing so much of it throughout the country right now, but things that you've observed resulting from this, whether it's environmental pollution, natural pollution, or if it is from climate change. Like a lot of the, I know we're seeing stronger winds here. The area I used to live in down in Texas is now seeing flooding, which we never saw when I was living there. So a lot of this is changing. So if you'll post in the chat some of the changes you observed, and then as you're posting, I'm going to just wrap things up here in the interest of time. Learning from the generative power of nature. I think one of the final lessons to take from this kind of framing of environmental ethics around the concept of eudaimonia is that nature does have that power to bounce back. Basically, if we get out of the way long enough. So if we allow it to, nature does tend to regenerate. And there are some valuable lessons philosophically for humans to learn from that. The idea of resilience and, a positive attitude, having gratitude for what's there. So a lot of the things that the science of happiness is teaching us within that area of eudaimonia. And then I'll just close things out. I had a new collection of poetry come out last week, and I felt this particular poem, it's one of them included in the book called Sunrise Sunset, really kind of wraps up exactly what we've been talking about tonight. The poem's called Home, and it basically goes like this. A space becomes a meaningful place from the moment it is met, making memories as we roam from sunrise to sunset. Displaced by disaster, reclaimed by the master, place authors the tome, beacon beckons us home. And this was actually written on our trip in Traverse City up in northern Michigan when we were waiting to board the Tall Ship, which was a sailing ship that actually, ironically, had been built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then shipped over to Traverse City, Michigan. But on that note, I will stop talking. I've done a lot of talking tonight, and open it up if anyone has questions or comments.
There were a few comments about changes people have observed. Light pollution,
yeah.
Shortening, inconsistent winters impacting the ski season, ticks. Someone else also said so many ticks. I never had to worry about ticks running around in the woods where I grew up in Peterborough. a
You know, we're
huge,
seeing a lot of that. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and my hometown in Pennsylvania is just overridden with ticks now. And we used to have a few, but it was never like this.
and then a huge decrease in fireflies and bats. And there were so many when I was growing up. A couple of people mentioned less snow in winter, leaves water tables, wells low in summer. And last summer was definitely an example of that.
And another person on Facebook worries about the devastating effects on lakes and waterways from acidification and algae blooms of that increased nutrient runoff.
Yeah, Michelle shares, coming from California, droughts, huge fires have been the biggest. Bird species moving north that used to be in our local area. Noise and more noise.
I have two siblings that live, one's in LA and one is in Malibu. And they've shared with me some of the reports that they've been reading on the expectations that the populations, like in that LA region, are going to have to push north because that will end up being very desert-like in the relatively near future. So that'll be interesting too as populations start to shift in these massive cities.
Yeah, there are a lot of really good concerns here. Loss of soil diversity or soil biodiversity, coastal flooding, which is important for New Hampshire here. I grew up in Berlin, New Hampshire, and have definitely seen how the environment has improved since the paper mills are no longer there. So that's a positive comment. And L. Hooper also shared light pollution.
Yeah, we're definitely living in a very interesting time that I guess it's kind of unfortunate that it's taken us as long as it has to really start to pay attention. But it's also not too late yet if we can switch up a lot of these behaviors. It was interesting with the global pandemic and forcing so many humans to stay home is watching the wildlife, a lot of non-human animals as well as plants and the reactions that happen just in a year of changing behaviors up, even though it was forced on many of us worldwide.
Well, I have one final comment from someone on Facebook that just says that she really appreciates your optimism for our future. And I want to thank you, Maria, for kicking us off so wonderfully. It was really fun listening to your stories and learning about environmental ethics with you this evening.
Well, thank you, because this has been a lot of fun. This is one of the areas I'm very passionate about. So I really appreciate having the opportunity tonight.
And for everyone that's still listening in, I just want to thank you for joining us on our kickoff of our Exploring Connections webinar series, hosted by New Hampshire Audubon and supported by a grant from New Hampshire Humanities Council. I'll be sending out a link to an evaluation for this webinar. We're interested in hearing what you have to say about how we're doing. And yeah, like I mentioned at the start of the program, this is one of like 24 talks. So please do check us out on our website, the same spot that you found this registration link. Our next presentation is just next week. Maria is going to be back with more of a workshop-based presentation. And then Diane and I and Becky Swamala are going to be talking about community science. And then as we get later into April and in May, we've got Dr. Marianne McGarry talking about the power of place-based writing. Someone from the National Wildlife Federation talking about gardening for wildlife, and going kind of further into our pollinator focused talks through the spring. And that'll do it. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Diane.
Thanks, Mark.
Great night, everybody. Mark, do we want to make sure we capture the chat?
Yep, I
Because
can
there's
do that.
really a lot of good information there.
Yeah, a lot of great, great suggestions. Like a kind of a sigh of relief when I take us off Facebook Live. So now I've got, okay, so I think I'd just get it into the chat and then save it. Save chat. Cool. Yeah, and I can email that over to you.
That would be great.
Oh,
Mark, I can't remember if you mentioned that you're going to be sending